Late November 2013 was the most ordinary kind of busy for a major retailer. Brighter lights, longer lines, faster checkout rhythms, and the steady hum of payment terminals handling thousands of small, routine purchases each hour. Inside those normal motions, something abnormal was beginning to unfold, an intrusion that would later be recognized as one of the defining payment card incidents of that decade. The reason it mattered was not only the scale, but also the timing, the period around Thanksgiving and mid December, when stores are full, systems are under pressure, and the margin for distraction is thin. According to a U.S. Senate staff report, the affected window for card use in U.S. stores spanned from November 27th to December 18th, 2013. In a documentary retelling, the first critical detail is that a payment card incident rarely announces itself with a single loud alarm. Instead, it often appears as a set of subtle clues: unusual network activity, unfamiliar system behavior, or alerts that look technical and easy to defer when business is demanding attention elsewhere. In this case, Target executives later testified that they were not aware of the intrusion until they were contacted by the U.S. Department of Justice on December 12, 2013. A reminder that sometimes outside signals arrive before internal certainty does. Then the story accelerated. Public reporting brought the issue into the open on December 18th, 2013, and Target publicly confirmed the payment card exposure on December 19th, 2013. Those dates matter because they show how quickly a private technical problem becomes a public trust problem. The company's public messaging emphasized regret, urgency, and the intent to protect guests, while also describing a defined period in which purchases might have been affected. The human side of this phase is easy to overlook. Millions of people do not experience a network intrusion, they experience uncertainty, wondering whether a routine purchase created risk, whether they should replace a card, whether they should watch statements more carefully, and whether messages they receive are legitimate. In the weeks after the disclosure, consumer agencies and state offices also warned people to be careful about lookalike emails and misleading offers that imitate official help. The incident, in other words, produced a secondary problem. Confusion can become an opportunity for opportunists, even when the original event is already being addressed. What makes Part 1 educational is the way it frames the core lesson. Payment systems are built for speed and convenience, so when they fail, the consequences spread beyond the retailer's walls. Banks, card networks, customers, and customer service teams all absorb friction at the same time. A breach is not only a technical moment, it is a moment of coordination between investigators trying to understand what happened, leaders trying to communicate responsibly, and ordinary customers trying to protect themselves without panic. By the end of December 2013, the public knew the basic outline. The exposure involved payment card data, the window was tied to peak shopping weeks, and a large number of cards were potentially impacted. And that is where the documentary lens pauses, at the point where a seasonal retail story becomes a national conversation about third-party access, internal alerts, and how modern checkout systems can be targeted when defenses are uneven. To understand how a large retailer can be affected at scale, it helps to start not with the checkout lane, but with the ecosystem behind it. Big retail operations depend on many outside partners: maintenance, logistics, system support, invoicing, and specialized contractors. That dependence is practical and necessary, yet it also creates a delicate challenge. A network can be well guarded at the front gate while still having side doors, connections designed for legitimate business use that become attractive to intruders. Public accounts and later summaries described a scenario in which attackers likely gained a foothold by using credentials stolen from a third-party contractor connected to target systems. One widely cited description points to an HVAC contractor relationship and notes that the contractor had remote access tied to vendor workflows such as billing, proposals, or project management. Reuters similarly described attackers accessing target systems through credentials stolen from a third-party vendor, reflecting the central role vendor access played in the broader incident narrative. This is an important educational point. Vendor access is not automatically bad security. It is often a rational business choice, outsourcing specialized work while keeping operations efficient. The problem emerges when access is broader than it needs to be, when segmentation between vendor systems and sensitive systems is weaker than intended, or when monitoring of those pathways is treated as a lower priority than monitoring direct employee logins. In the Senate staff report's framing, the breach raised concerns about whether sensitive network assets were properly isolated and whether warning signals were handled with enough urgency. In a calm documentary tone, we can imagine the attacker's advantage as mostly procedural rather than dramatic. If you have a valid credential, even one that belongs to a vendor, you may look at first glance like a legitimate user. That can reduce the chance of immediate detection, especially when systems are noisy with holiday traffic and routine vendor communications. The intrusion becomes a test of discipline. Are access permissions minimal? Are vendor accounts monitored with the same intensity as internal accounts? Are unusual login patterns escalated quickly? The deeper lesson is about trust boundaries. Organizations often assume that certain zones of the network are safe because they are used for ordinary business processes. But safety is not a label, it is a continuous practice. When a vendor portal or contractor connection becomes a stepping stone, it reveals that security is only as consistent as its least consistent segment. The Senate report suggested that Target may not have responded effectively to multiple warnings, and that failures in isolation and alert response contributed to the incident's severity. This is why the vendor elements became so central to how the public understood the story. The breach was not portrayed as a single supercomputer problem. It was portrayed as a governance problem. How access is granted, how it is reviewed, how it is monitored, and what happens when alerts arrive during the busiest weeks of the year. In complex organizations, the most serious risk is rarely a lack of technology alone. It is the gap between what policies say should happen and what busy teams, juggling priorities, actually do in real time. By the end of part 2, the audience can hold a clearer picture. The incident was not only about payment terminals, it was about interconnected systems and the reality that a modern retailer's network is a community. Employees, tools, partners, and vendors, where a weakness in any one relationship can become a pathway into more sensitive areas. When people hear payment card breach, they often imagine stolen databases, but retail payment incidents frequently revolve around something more immediate, the moment a card is used. In many checkout environments, payment data is briefly present in system memory as transactions are processed. If malicious software reaches the right systems, it can attempt to capture that information during that short window. The Target incident became widely discussed because the impact was connected to in-store purchases across a defined period, and because it suggested that internal defenses did not fully prevent movement toward point-of-sale systems. The Senate staff report described a series of concerns that, in plain language, translate into two ideas the public can understand. First, network segmentation matters. If the most sensitive systems are not strongly separated from less sensitive ones, an intruder who gets into a work area may find pathways toward a payment area. Second, alerts matter only if they lead to action. The report suggested Target appeared to have failed to respond effectively to warnings from security tools about attacker activity and planned data removal routes. This is where the educational documentary tone can be especially helpful. The story is not improved by turning it into a thriller. It is improved by turning it into a case study about how organizations interpret signals. Most large networks generate constant alerts, many harmless, some ambiguous. The true differentiator is how quickly ambiguous becomes investigated and how strongly the organization is prepared to treat certain alerts as urgent, even when daily operations are demanding attention elsewhere. Imagine a control room with dashboards and notifications. Some alarms are false positives, some are real. Over time, teams can become conditioned to treat alerts as background noise, especially if tools are mistuned or if staffing is thin. The Senate report's analysis suggests that Target's security posture at the time did not consistently translate warning signals into containment steps fast enough to prevent large-scale exposure. When an incident touches payment systems, the consequences spread quickly because the same event affects multiple institutions at once. Banks may see unusual patterns and respond by monitoring or reissuing cards. Card networks may coordinate with issuers. Customers may receive messages that vary in clarity. That multi-party nature is one reason payment card incidents reshape industry behavior. A single retailer's issue can become a shared operational burden for many organizations. In documentary terms, this part of the story is about how scale happens. Scale happens when three conditions align: a pathway into the network, insufficient separation between zones, and a delay in response that allows activity to continue during a high volume period. The Target incident is often remembered because it brought those conditions into public view and because it arrived at a cultural moment when many consumers were only beginning to think seriously about cybersecurity in everyday shopping. By the end of part 3, the audience is left with the sober takeaway: you do not need sensational details to understand the heart of the case. The heart is procedural. A modern retail network is complex, and complexity rewards intruders when monitoring and segmentation are inconsistent. The incident became a lesson in how small gaps, repeated across large systems, can produce large outcomes. After a major incident becomes public, the story enters a second phase, the phase of reconstruction. Investigators continue to examine logs, systems, and pathways. Leaders continue to communicate, and the public continues to ask a simple question: what does this mean for me? In Target's case, the early public statements focused on payment card data and a defined time frame. But as the investigation continued, Target later announced that additional guest information, separate from payment card data, had been taken, including names and contact details for up to 70 million individuals. This is a common feature in major investigations. Early findings rarely capture the full scope. As forensic teams expand the search, they may discover related exposures that occurred in the same broader incident window. The emotional effect on the public, however, can be difficult. An initial disclosure sets expectations, and a later expansion can feel like the ground shifting. Even if it reflects honest investigation progress, it can be interpreted as uncertainty. That is why clear communication, dates, categories of data, and what is known versus still being analyzed matters so much. Target's response included offering 1 year of free credit monitoring and identity protection for customers who shopped at its U.S. stores, a move referenced in public communications and widely echoed by government offices encouraging residents to take advantage of the offer. This response step shows the delicate balance organizations face. They must provide helpful services without creating confusion that makes people vulnerable to look-alike messages. Some consumer agencies warned about misleading emails that used the situation to trick recipients, highlighting the need for careful verification of any message tied to free monitoring offers. Meanwhile, the company was also facing the practical consequences of public trust under strain. A retailer's brand is built on routine comfort, Customers expect a smooth, ordinary experience. When a security incident breaks that feeling, the recovery is not only technical, it is relational. Customer service lines surge, questions multiply. People ask banks what to do. Banks ask the retailer what happened. Regulators ask for timelines, and internal teams work under intense scrutiny. In the months that followed, Target leaders addressed the incident publicly and in formal settings. For example, reporting in early 2014 described corporate apologies and reviews of the network and security posture, reflecting how such incidents force organizations to talk about security in public terms rather than internal jargon. This part of the documentary story is also about cost, not only money, but attention. Every hour spent responding to a large incident is an hour diverted from planned work. Every confusing rumor creates extra workload. Every unclear message generates follow up. The incident becomes a lesson in preparedness. Organizations need not only defenses, but also communication plans, customer support capacity, and coordination structures for working with banks, networks, and government contacts. By the end of part 4, the audience can see the second wave reality. The breach was not a single day headline, it was an unfolding investigation with expanding scope, customer care decisions, and a long recovery arc. The incident's impact lived not only in what was taken, but in how many people had to change their routines, monitoring accounts, resetting expectations, and learning, sometimes for the first time, how digital risk can touch everyday errands. As investigations continued, another pattern emerged. Major cybersecurity incidents often become leadership tests. Boards and executives must demonstrate accountability, not only by fixing systems, but by explaining why systems were not resilient enough in the first place. In Target's case, the leadership consequences became public in 2014. News reporting documented that Target's chairman and CEO Greg Steinhafel stepped down on May 5, 2014, after months of fallout and scrutiny. From an educational point of view, leadership change is not simply a dramatic chapter, it is a governance signal. It tells stakeholders that the event is being treated as a business critical failure, not a minor technical issue. For large organizations, trust is a form of capital. When trust is damaged, it can affect revenue, partnerships, employee morale, and the willingness of customers to return without hesitation. The financial costs also became part of the public record. Reporting in 2015 described Target's breach related expenses, not covered by insurance, reaching $162 million, with discussion of gross costs and insurance offsets. These numbers matter in a documentary retelling because they show that the cost of a breach is not limited to immediate technical response. It includes investigations, customer support, legal work, settlements, and long term improvements. Then comes the slowest part of the story: legal resolution. Large incidents typically produce multiple legal tracks. consumer claims, financial institution claims, and regulatory actions. Court documents and legal summaries show that consumer litigation led to a settlement that was approved by the court in November 2015, reflecting the long timeline from incident to structured compensation and agreed reforms. This legal phase is often less visible than headlines, but it is where many concrete commitments are formalized. Security program changes, oversight structures, and defined responsibilities. Finally, there is the multi state regulatory dimension. In May 2017, state attorneys general announced a settlement of $18.5 million with Target tied to the 2013 breach, described as a record multi state settlement at the time, and requiring specific measures to strengthen protections. This matters because it illustrates how cybersecurity expectations evolve into enforceable standards. Policies become requirements, and reasonable safeguards becomes a practical checklist that regulators can point to. In documentary terms, Part 5 is the chapter where the incident moves from what happened to what changes. It also clarifies why prevention budgets and governance reforms become easier to justify after a breach. The cost of learning is far higher when the lesson arrives through public failure. By the end of this part, the audience understands that the Target incident became a long running event with a clear arc: public disclosure, leadership consequences, major financial impact, and multi year legal outcomes. The breach did not end when malware was removed or systems were rebuilt. It ended slowly through agreements, oversight, and the gradual rebuilding of confidence. The most valuable reason to revisit the Target payment card incident today is not to repeat the headline numbers, but to understand why the case became such a powerful teaching tool for the entire retail industry. In the simplest terms, it demonstrated that cybersecurity is not a separate IT topic. It is part of operations, vendor management, finance, customer trust, and leadership accountability, all at once. One enduring lesson is the importance of controlling third-party pathways. Multiple public accounts emphasized that access credentials linked to a vendor relationship were a likely starting point, showing why vendor access must be tightly limited, continuously reviewed, and monitored with seriousness equal to internal accounts. In modern organizations, vendors are part of the extended enterprise. That means governance must extend outward as well. A second lesson is segmentation and containment. The Senate staff reports concerns about isolating sensitive assets and responding to security tool warnings underscored how defensive layers must work together. If alerts arrive but do not trigger decisive investigation, the organization is effectively relying on luck. If network zones are connected too loosely, an initial foothold can become something larger. In a calm, educational tone, the message is straightforward. Good security assumes that some perimeter will eventually be tested, so internal boundaries and rapid response must be strong. A third lesson is communication discipline. Target's public statements and subsequent updates show the reality of evolving investigations. Early information may later expand as forensic work continues. The best organizations are not those that never revise their understanding. They are those that communicate what is known, what is unknown, and what steps people can take without exaggeration, without minimizing, and without creating unnecessary fear. A fourth lesson is how quickly an incident becomes a social event. Government offices encouraged people to use legitimate credit monitoring offers while warning about misleading messages that imitate official outreach. This teaches a subtle point. After a breach, the information environment matters. Clear, verified channels reduce confusion, while confusion creates secondary risk. And finally, there is the governance lesson. Consequences do not stop at technical remediation. Leadership changes, documented costs, and multi-year settlements show that cybersecurity failures are treated as business failures. The Target case became part of why many retailers accelerated investments in payment security practices, incident response maturity, and stronger oversight of third-party access and internal alerts. In a closing documentary frame, the Target incident can be summarized as a story about modern interdependence. A retailer depends on vendors. Vendors depend on credentials. Networks depend on segmentation. Security depends on alerts becoming action. Customers depend on clear communication. And leaders depend on governance that treats cybersecurity as a core responsibility, not a background function. That is why the case remains educational. It teaches that large incidents are rarely caused by a single dramatic failure. They are more often caused by ordinary gaps, permissions that are too broad, warnings that are too easy to postpone, and systems that are too connected. The lesson is not to fear technology, but to respect it, to design operations so that when something goes wrong, it is contained quickly, communicated clearly, and followed by improvements that are real and measurable.